If we would, let me pray here a second, and we'll begin. Father, I thank you for the opportunity again to discuss and think about your ways. As Randy and I were talking, no matter how awed I am by them, I'm certainly not awed enough. May tonight be one of those nights when I gain ground, where I realize that you're not only near, you're very near, and that all of the things that I say are true about you actually are much truer than I say they are and that I believe they are. Help us tonight so that I can make some sense of these things and that these people can profit from it, your people, your sheep. And I know very well that you have your eye on us. In Christ's name I ask all of this, amen. I wanted to start, I was actually going to say, I had a talk with the teacher after last class. He was a little hyper. But I talked to him and he promised to be a little slower this go around. He was kind of excited. But I wanted to make sure I got through. I know this is a funny idea that the foundation for evangelism is going to be the doctrines of grace. I know that that's not the way people normally talk about it, think about it, and address it, but to me, it makes sense, and I hope that when I'm through, you'll realize that it makes sense. I hope I can prove that to you. So the foundation for me is right here. It seems like it would end right there for most people. If I'm able to convince you next week is total depravity and the following week is a discussion on free will, if I can convince you of the biblical state of man that you run into, I mean, if we pull the first guy off the street tonight, right, and we just stand him up here, by the time we get through with the Bible's examination of him, he's going to be one sorry character. And I think the problem is lots of times we stop right here. Sometimes in Reformed circles, we'll go to here and we say, oh, I see, God does it. Well, he does do it. But God doesn't do it alone. You know why? He hasn't chosen to do it alone. Does he do it alone sometimes? I was on my way to Damascus, right? That happens, doesn't it? And when we come there, you can see it's pretty easy to make the case, well, it doesn't look like he was trying very hard to convert to Christianity at that moment, and he didn't need anybody on the earth to be whispering in his ear. But in normal way of speaking, God normally wants us to use our voices to speak to men, and then we're actually going to ask them to do, if I could, I would put in here at an angle, we're going to ask them to do what they can't do. Aren't we? I just convince you that he's in such bad shape that God has to intervene, and then I say to you, tell him to raise his withered hand, the one he can't raise. Does that make sense? It is God's way of showing you that when that hand gets raised, he did it. See, that's really what we're asking here. So if I make this case that God, this is so bad that God has to do this, then these, and that's why you'll see the emphasis on the reading and things, is never going to be, for me, here. Why? Limited atonement, I can go to a Grace Bible Chapel someplace and the guy will be a 4-point Calvinist. Now that doesn't make any sense to me. But, you know what? Will he still, can I talk to him about how to present the gospel? Yes. Are we going to be on the same page that it's God doing the work? Yes. You see, this is more of an intramural thing that I'm addressing. Irresistible grace, you won't find, at least I don't find, anybody who believes this who isn't okay with this. So that's not going to be the problem. The same way with the perseverance. They'll all be sort of vague on perseverance, generally. If you say, well, God's is sovereign in your sanctification as he was in your... If I just make that simple statement to a guy, okay, I guess I get that. Work out your salvation with fear and trembling, right? For it's God who's at work in you. Okay, I get that. All right. No problem. So the problem always lies either here, where you've got a case where the guy doesn't believe the man's quite as bad as I made him out to be. He's sick, right? He's sick and he can't sit up on the bed, but if you can tilt his head up by speaking to him, you can put the spoon to his lips, Billy Graham used to say, and he can sip. When I go to the funeral home, you can prop him up, you can do that, and he's not going to sip. Now, here's the problem. Reformed people go misunderstand one thing. By the time you get through discussing that he's deaf and blind and all these other things and dead, they don't want to talk to him at all. They leave God to do it by himself. You see, we make that mistake. Why? Later on, I'm going to say, he gets what he doesn't want to get. You get it, don't you? I mean, in other words, when I speak to him and I say, there's a heaven and a hell and a God and somebody answerable to that God and those kinds of statements, he gets it. He just doesn't want to get it. You see what I mean? We say he's blind. What we really mean by that is his thinking is so bad and he's so intent on having God be dead. There was a famous poem one time where a guy said to this character, Matthias, Matthias, you told me God was dead. You may have buried him alive. And that's really what everybody in their darkness, this group included, wanted to do. We wanted to bury him, and we weren't able to do it because he's alive. You see, but in our minds, we could put him out of our minds, couldn't we? To some extent. See, so if I say to people, well, that guy's got the withered hand, tell him to raise it. That's really what you're asking him to do. They say, well, what sense does that make? God commanded it. It's his normal way of doing things. And sometimes, everybody in here, with the withered hands in here, raised their hands. You see? Why? Well, because God's sovereign. Unconditionally elected you. That's why. That's why I said, you know, I may find it easy to be the woman in Luke 7 who's very grateful for weeping over Jesus' feet and those things, because I've done so many miserable, stinking things. It's hard for me to escape them. If I drive down the street where we come from, I can hardly go by an address, literally, and I mean that, where I don't have a bad memory. I don't remember very many things good, but I do it to remind myself that I ought to be grateful. Okay? Now, my wife has the opposite thing, and we were talking about it the last couple of days, where God shielded her from things. She led more of a morally right life, and of course, where does that usually lead? Well, you'll be prideful as can be. That's what happens, you know what I mean? And pretty soon you can't even remember when you had a cross sentence with somebody. Well, that's a different problem, but it's all from the same root, isn't it? And I'm saying to you, we all fit into these categories, and I'm trying to make sure that I'm grateful, and that you are, and that you realize that not one person in here, in his eyes, there wasn't anything in you, not a single thing. No matter how many times you say that to yourself, you still want to raise your little hand in your objection and find something of merit, and I'm telling you, it's a waste of time. I've searched all the closets in your house, and all I found was dirty laundry. Okay, that's all. So we just all have a reason to be grateful. Some of us believe that we have more of a reason when we really don't. It's just that we may have been more publicly humiliated at one time or another. Now, I listed these only because you can make a judgment on Dr. Gerstner's evangelism take. I found it to be pleasing, and here's why when I come over here. Today, when I was thinking about it, this came to my mind. When I was an Arminian, for lack of just saying when I was first interested in these things, I had a view of God, right, when I converted. I had a view of man, and I had a view of evangelism. And I told you the other night, mine was a formulaic thing where I could sit and go through making you afraid of hell. I could tell these things, you know what I mean? And then I would have you decide that you didn't want to go to hell. That was basically what I was doing. I thought it was conversion. I was wrong. Perhaps you too. But This is how they taught it to me. God wanted to save that man. You know what I mean? I wanted to save that man, and it was really resting a lot on my way of doing it. That's why I would resort. If somebody would have taught me the Romans road first, I would have used the Romans road, or whatever other formula you've heard, the 4 spiritual laws, you hear all sorts of things. When you really want to have a conversation with somebody like a girl, did you have a little formula if you're a guy? I got 4 points, as long as I can make these 4 points. No, that's not how it is. You have a normal conversation. Why is it the most important conversation you can have, we boil down to points? Well, 1, it turns out to be heartless when you do it mostly. 2, we just didn't know what else to do, and somebody said, this is evangelism. Now, if you looked in the Scriptures, would you have gotten it from the Scriptures? Did it look like somebody in the Scriptures? Did you hear Peter saying it in Acts 2? Or do you hear anybody preaching like that in the Scriptures? No, you don't. But the church did it that way, and I learned to do it that way, and probably you did too. So it dawned on me. When we became Reformed, we got a better picture of God as the awesome sovereign God that He is. We got a better idea of man. He was a lot worse than we thought he was, right? And then we changed our form of evangelism. Oh, we did, huh? I didn't hear it. No, what happened is they changed these for us in the Reformed. When did they talk about evangelism? You see, they forgot to change out my box on evangelism. So what did they leave me with, Mary? The old one. See, these two still match here. That's the problem I'm saying. Now, am I saying that in all cases? Heaven forbid, no. There are some smart guys around in some good churches, and this is one of them. They do a better job. But in general, Reformed people have not done a good job of evangelizing, and they're the only people on the face of the earth who ought to. Dr. Gerstner was always real strong in this. He'd say, if you find a guy who pastors a church and doesn't know how to tell people to come to Christ, you need to tell them to sit down and learn and then come back into the ministry. Now, I know he doesn't, but the reason he did that was remember what in John 3, you would have this thing in John 3 where he's talking, and when he makes that statement, like, what am I supposed to do, go back in my mother's womb? Jesus said, are you the teacher in Israel? You see, what's he saying? Well, you don't know what you're doing. You're not talking about this right. So I want you to get this as a foundation because I don't want us to be silent. Certainly the people with the sacraments are always silent. They just baptize you. And they wait until that. Or they begin with that. The surrender people, that's me, the old formula. This, as the pastor said, you didn't say, really, this is what happens if you're Reformed and don't know what to do. It may be a step above silence, but it's sort of like, boy, they're lost. Yeah. God's sovereign. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's get back to talking about limited atonement. See, that's kind of what happens. And I make fun of us because we all do it. Now, you may not. And if you're really much sharper than this, then you'll have to forgive me. But it's just normally that's what happens. And I'm saying to you, I'm hoping to change the way I do things. And if you think that I've got this all figured out, I'm thinking it through a lot right now because I do say certain things, and I'm realizing now I have to break them down a little better in my own thinking. One of the things I would like to do is to kill decisionalism. But I don't want to kill decisions. This is a formula. It's not right. It's harmful. It's dangerous. I promise you, this does damage because I'm going to invariably, like I did, get everybody in my family saved, and they won't even have repented. They're sorry for their sin, and they don't wish to go to hell, but that doesn't make them have that burden of anything about their sin. So what kind of Christians do you think I'm going to produce? Some real wild rascals who looked very much like the ones they were before, but now safe for heaven. You see, in their own mind. Very dangerous, and I did it. The decision's a different thing. Like I said to Randy, If you want to know what I'm going to say to them, I'm going to say, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and be saved. Well, wait a minute. No, but I'm going to say it's more than a mental assent. You follow me? That's the kind of conversation I want us to be able to have eventually. And you'll see why we'll get there where we're actually talking about that, I hope. Now, the reason I did this is I want you to understand, eventually I can, if I talk, and I said to Randy, if I talk to the girl who's tending bar over here tonight, I can convince her that God's in charge of her birth. Just in a normal conversation. If I ask her how the life works, did you choose your husband? Did God do it? What if you'd have missed him? Isn't it a divine appointment? They'll all have a form of it. You understand? It's a romantic idea they have, but they have it. What about war? Eventually I can convince them that God's in charge of wars, nations, work, your career, who gave you your talents. You don't have to be converted for me to get you to understand of most of these things. You have a broken leg. Did I say broken? Sometimes I leave a letter out. So you have a broken leg. I can convince you that it might be in your best interest. Did God slow you down? Is there any sort of thing? Death. The one thing they'll always stop you when it comes to missionaries and Arminian pastors and bartenders is the second birth. You see, where does it belong? Well, I know where it belongs. It belongs here. The second birth is just as much to do with God's sovereignty. It's not outside of there. You see, but I promise you that's where the wall goes up. So I'm going to try to persuade you that we can make them see that it belongs here. That's all. And we're headed that direction. And then I ask you this, do we believe what we believe? Real simple, because sometimes we say, I believe God's sovereign. And we say yes, and we still have to do our speak yes, and then we still shrug. If we shrug, we must not believe that what we say is important. You see, we have to come to believe that everything that we do has to be done well, and everything we do is not only important, it's important in God's story. You see, when Randy speaks to me, he may say something that influences me to say something that influences Ron. You follow me? And he better be on his toes. He better be up studying. He better be praying. He better do all those things he's called to do. Why? They make a difference. How do they make a difference? God ordained that he'd be praying. God ordained that he'd be up. You follow? Studying. All of those things are part of God putting his quilt together that is his story, that is the history of mankind. That's sovereignty as I understand it. And I'm going to try to show it to you in that way tonight. Now, if you look at this little notes that we gave out, I will give you the test questions at the end, and I'm hoping we can get through so you can understand where I'm headed with this and why I try to tie it together. I always think of this, if I'm sitting somewhere with an unbeliever, sometimes I'll say something like, Shakespeare once said, there's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them as we may. And be like, what's that mean? I said, well, see, they'll let Shakespeare get 2 or 3 shots at him. They're only worried about the Apostle Paul. Okay, they don't like him. But they don't mind Shakespeare, they don't know him. So they're okay with him. What it is that you are going to run right across in that thing. There's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them as we may. He happens to be right. You and I do what we want. And we're always under God's control doing it, aren't we? That's really always going to be the crux of when you deal with this subject or with people in general. How far does your freedom extend, and how far does God's? Forget how many different ways I say it to you. It's coming back to that same crucial point all the time. So when I give you the test questions, you'll understand that a lot of them fall into that. You won't notice it right off, but if you hang in there, pretty soon I'll say to you, there's only 6 questions. They're just stated different ways. You have to see that it's the same question behind the question. So that when you're talking to people, you become aware that there are really just a handful of questions you have to go back to. That's what I hope I can help you with. And you may be able to really help me with that, but I know this. There's a few of those things I've learned about it. Like, for instance, you came here tonight. How many did it of their own free will? How many were under God's control? Well, there you go. See, pretty good at this theology stuff. Because it does work like that. But see how simple examples sometimes are the best teachers, aren't they? Before we get too complicated. That's why I like to use stories about men's lives, because when I'm talking to people, it's their lives they're interested in. Not terminology. They want to know how this affects their life. And I want us to think about it that way. Westminster Confession of Faith. God, the great creator of all things, doth uphold, direct, dispose, and govern all creatures, actions, and things. The only thing I'm always saying to myself on that, I try to remember that he upholds all things, although the average discussion doesn't include it so much. I have to be careful to make sure I understand it, because in him we live and move and have our being. You can't forget it. You can't forget that he makes the sun come up. You can't turn this into a mechanical world where God set it a-spinning and walked away. If you do, you're misrepresenting the way he governs this world. Okay? He sends the rain. We quit talking about it like that. We complain about his sending the rain, in fact, because we don't remember it. At least I do. But if you think about it, the old-timers always said, maybe God will send the rain. And they were right, and I'm wrong. The same thing happens here when you think about how he directs and disposes. People say, well, those terms, that's why I don't use them very often, because they don't come in handy in a normal conversation. But for you, you know that he's mainly governing what things? All actions, coming here tonight, all creatures, everybody we see, right? And all things, from the greatest to the least. That gallstone you had, any chance at all that God governed it? See, when it gets down to these things, and you start asking yourself and people, do I believe this? You will keep repeating this little mantra. What do I believe when I believe? That seems like I hadn't really considered it. And yet, when we go through 1 Kings tonight, you remember, if you read it, it makes a very hard case not to believe in it. So, when you get down to Richard Phillips, the reason I put this in here, the second line, by sovereignty we mean that God actually governs everything. See how simply stated that was? That's why I liked his book. I like things that the average guy doesn't have to wrestle with. By everything we mean all things that happen, from the greatest to the least of all occurrences. If you've got a Baptist pastor who's sort of never been in the loop of having somebody to talk to about these things, or a missionary, they'll have trouble not reverting to a strictly Arminian presentation, because they think you send them money to do what? Save souls. I'm sure they'd have cut Noah off somewhere along the line. You know what I mean? Because you're going to get graded on being faithful. It's God who produces the fruit. Isn't that right? We say it, but then we always want to take that mantle on ourselves. If I could say to you, the only verse that you probably ever need to know to discuss this subject with anybody is to ask them, if this Bible, if you have an unbeliever and you're saying, I'm trying to get this through my head, God says if two birds are sold for a penny, if one of them falls to the ground, it was the will of his Father. I don't get it. You're going to have an awful big discussion about how that works, because if they say, well, I can see that God had governed the birds. Well, what about the dog that came up and nipped your ankle? Why didn't God control him? Pretty soon I want to know why God didn't stop your husband from running off with the neighbor. See, they have pain, and as I said before, they want significance. And unfortunately, the only place they're ever going to really find it is in this church. When God explains to them that he's always been making them significant, they will quit looking for it everywhere else. That's where we're headed with these things, because they care about their lives. And does it matter which door opens that discussion, where pretty soon you're saying, here's God being sovereign over Mary, and sin's one of the problems. You ever disobeyed your God? The one you now like, you told me you like him governing you. Well, then you probably go right along with anything he'd want you to do. Well, I see. That didn't happen, did it? Now you're going to get a chance to talk about sin and some other things. That's where we're headed with this kind of sovereignty. And then he finishes with this. God's sovereignty in salvation means that believers are saved for this sole ultimate reason, according to God's sovereign will. We are saved according to God's sovereign purpose, by God's sovereign working, according to God's sovereign will. Well, that's where we get to the shrug. You see what happens here? All of a sudden, we're at Ephesians 1:11, right? And just let me read it to you, in case you're not familiar with it. In him also we have obtained an inheritance, being predestined according to the purpose of him who works all things according to the counsel of his own will. Well, there you go. He's out there doing, one of the questions that you'll get is, people say to you, then a pastor usually will say, well, welcome to Puppetville. Mr. Moore, where are the strings that are attached to your back? You see, you can see where they make that mistake. And you think to yourself, is that a bad thing? No, I actually like it if they ask that, because you can address that. You know what I mean? I just look on their back, because they already conceded a few things about sovereignty, you know. Look like they'd have some strings too. But you want to understand that question is really always going to lead to one final question. How did God interfere with my free will? It's free as can be. See, I just gave you another example of where it's going to, no matter how they state it, I promise you, it isn't really about that. It's about the question behind it, which is, I don't want anybody tinkering with my free will. That's always standing in the shadows, believe me. So, down here, concurrence and second causes. Now, I might be wrong about this. I would finish with the same example that I had before. Well, here's my answer to what are concurrence and second causes. You need to know it. You came here, right? We're back to where we began. You came here, and God controlled you coming here. Well, okay, you already got concurrence. I can see that. You got this figured out. Now all I got to do is explain to you there's only one first cause. Well, everything else must be second causes. The flu you got, the car you drove, whatever happened when you wrecked. See, when you're talking to people, even if you're teaching in Sunday school, I'm not sure that we are as effective at building the skeleton of this thing and then putting the flesh on it as we are as giving them body parts all the time and telling them to go ahead and put them wherever they belong. You know how we do that? Kind of in reform circles, we're real good at that. We teach you all these different doctrines, and then you're in the car like, okay, I think I got that one. And I say, where does it go? Well, I don't know. I don't think my man's ever going to walk. You got a man, he's not going to walk and talk. I see. Well, I don't want that kind of man. You see, we're supposed to give them the skeleton. This verse on sovereignty in Matthew 10 will serve them well. Now, I might give you 8 more verses if I'm in a book, but you know, I don't need to. If you can explain to me how that bird hits the ground, Jesus must be wrong or he's right, and you've solved your problem. And that's what I'm interested in when I do it, because overall, I'm still going to say this to you, history is his story. It's not, so if you say to somebody, hey, I finally figured it out, it's not about me. And I said today when we were eating lunch, it is really like this to me. I don't remember what you're supposed to call it in vaudeville, where they'd hold those canes and they'd do this across the stage, you know what I mean? That's you and me in this life, isn't it? Who stays on the stage? God. It's always been his stage. It's always been his story. We play an important part. We can't do it without Heidi. I can promise you she has to do her best. Why? God's telling his story. It's a very important story. He's going to be the main focus, and that's what they don't want, isn't it? It's what you didn't want. You wanted to be center stage. You wanted to be Katharine Hepburn, and somebody told you you were, for heaven's sake. You can go to a lot of churches today where they'll be sure to tell you it's all about you. Your best life now. I was running through that today. It still irritates me to hear that kind of stuff. Think about that now. What am I taking him and pointing that young man's eyes to? It's all about you. No, but we still act like it sometimes. It's his story. We have to get this straight. Well then, that he allows you to be this. Dr. Gershon used to always say, here's how it works. And I just quote him because I always liked the way he stated things. But he would say, Mr. Moore, the play is a success. The audience is a failure. You see, the audience can't see. So I said to him, now look, when I converted, and Randy, this is kind of what we were talking about. I converted, one day I didn't see it, right? And the next day I saw I was a sinner. And I called him and I said, I don't think the way you describe these things is right. I think I got it. It clicked. And he said, if you were in downtown, whatever town you live in, he said, you walked outside, the sun was always shining and you had blinders on. What happened? Did the sun start to shine or did you take the blinders off? I realized that was absolutely true. Every evidence that God existed and ought to rule over me was always there. I just did this as much as I could, right? If the blinders started to slip and you said something that got through to me, I'd try to put it back on and cover my eyes with my hands on top of it. I didn't want to see the light that was impossible to miss. I see that's why those folks go to hell who have only natural revelation, right? They look up at the stars and they say, they're pretty, but I'm not sure how they got there, and I don't think anybody's got enough information to figure it out. And the Bible says they're just suppressing the truth. You were too. That's the guy you're dealing with. That's the guy whose soul you're worried about. The guy who isn't worried about his own. Remember when you didn't worry about your own? Yeah. Now you can't figure out how he was that stupid. Really? You know what I mean? You can't? Can't you remember? Take out your yearbook. Take a look at yourself. Think about what you were thinking then. Huh? Oh, I see now. You're sanctified. You're a little better than that. But I want you to think about how you're really explaining. If I say Daniel 4:35, the only reason I will utilize sometimes a thing like Daniel 4:35, where he says, look, all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed to be as nothing. Right? God does his will in the armies of the heavens and among the inhabitants of the earth. Who will restrain his hand? Who will say, what have you done? Now, I think about it, I say, because I'm trying to say to people, can you understand how strong that statement is? All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing, and rightly so, in comparison to the one who's still on the stage, the one who's telling his story, the one who's getting all the applause at the end, isn't he? It's going to be his glory, not yours. It'd be wrong for me to tell you now. All you are is somebody who's been watching the play, refusing to uncover your eyes, to see it for what it is, and we want you to be a good audience member. We want you to shout hallelujah whenever the king comes on stage, and he's always on stage. There you go. That's what we're asking people to do. Have we lost sight of the fact that we're hunting for worshipers? Oh, maybe we're not. Maybe we're hunting for students. I forgot. We're of a different breed. But is he hunting for worshipers? Isn't that what he's wanting those audience members to, they're going to take their hands off their eyes. We start applauding. Why? The play is a success. It's wonderful. It can't be any better. The only way it could be better for me is if I could see it better, if I could understand it better. It isn't going to be that I'm going to understand it perfectly, but the glimpses I get of it are stunning. Okay? That's kind of how I try to impress myself with those kinds of really strong verses. Now, you may have a better way of doing that. When we get over here, if you take a look at the next page, mine doesn't match up. For in him we live and move and have our being, Acts 17:28. We really are going to be focusing not only on God's governing of men's lives, but on his governing of the second birth. So the main difference is going to be that you understand these two. Why do you understand this one? Because you get this one. That's what we're doing next week. And then Mr. Martin is going to help us, Martin Luther is going to help us on free will, because he's a murderer's row when it comes to free will. And we need to deal with it because I'm telling you, an amateur like me is not the right guy. Everybody that you run into, unbeliever or pastor of some church someplace will stumble over free will. Otherwise, he'll be here with you, worshiping already. And I suspect that even we have a degree of misapprehension about free will. And when we wrestle with it, I hope you're exhausted when he's done with you, because it's the way we ought to be. Now, I want to take a look at 1 Kings. Right out of that, if you did the reading, some of you didn't have it, so I'm going to go kind of what it was, my page 28 in a section of this little book, The Bartender's Guide to Providence. Is there anybody who doesn't have it? It should be in their week 2 part. It begins on page 28, 1 Kings 22. Now, I had actually begun by having 3 passages at the start of this book. 1 Kings 22. The other passage that was important to me is Romans 8:28. God makes all things work together for good, right? For those who are called according to his purpose, who love him, etc. Now, the third one I don't get to do in this course, which is what I would really like to do, because the average unbeliever, the only one they're really interested in first is the chastening. I mean, the average believer is the chastening aspect. And unbelievers get interested in it if I say to them, I think God's hand's on me, and Now, I'm going to say it real quickly, because chastening is a very important part of learning to bow your knee to sovereignty. If God promised you in Hebrews 12 that he'd chasten you because he loves you, when I'm in Sunday schools, no matter where I am, that passage, if you just show, and I mean this, if you take your Bible tonight, and just if you go someplace where there's a waitress or something and say, tell me if I'm crazy, you read the first few verses of this chapter for me. I don't care if you don't believe God exists. Read it for me anyway. Tell me what it means. They'll be like, well, looks like God's going to do something to you if he likes you. Now, mostly when you deal with people, you say then, well, okay, how many of you want to get up and tell me when you were chastened last? What you get is nothing. Why? God must be wrong. He must not really have chastened them. No, what happened was they were getting chastened, but they didn't know it. If you get a lesson and don't know you're getting the lesson, what's the chance you can benefit from it? Well, you get to suffer. Oh, that sounds like fun. Listen, if I'm going to suffer, right, because God loves me and chastens me and straightens me out and heats the fire under me and boils the pride out of me, I at least want to know what's going on. I want to know that I'm going to profit from it. I want to do more than just suffer. You can suffer the same, John, right? And be blind to it. And apparently, most people are, most Christians. You know why? They don't know what's going on. And no passage is clearer to me than that passage. Now, if I say to an unbeliever, any chance that you lost that job, is there any chance at all? Like recently I had a pastor who's walked away from God and done all those things. Now he's a Taoist. Well, when he only got nervous about it when he lost his job. Then it was a 3 a.m. conversation with me trying to figure out how mad God could have been at him. The best conversation I ever had with him. First time he ever got his ears open. You see, that's what happens to you when you're a Christian and you really start realizing that God's chastening you for what? For your good? Yeah, for your good. Not for your bad. He said it, but he said also it's going to be painful. Oh, I see. You're like me. You don't want any pain. You want the good. You like the end product. Just keep the pain somewhere distant from me. Okay? Well, we don't get that privilege, do we? God knows what he's doing. If you look at this idea of 1 Kings, again, I only say these kind of stories become important to me because people want to know about their lives. So you talk about lives. If you get too theoretical, people lose interest. It's just the way it is. They want to know how God governs their life on the end of this story. But it doesn't matter if you know all the details. It's beautiful if you know the details of Ahab and Jehoshaphat and all the background. It's wonderful. And the intrigue is just, there's no craft theater or whatever's on TV these days to match it. But the problem is, if you're just talking to people, as I said to Randy, I say the name Jehoshaphat because people just think it's funny. I don't, John Jehoshaphat, I'm the same guy. That's how it is. But if you say, well, look, here's a guy in a black hat. Here's a guy in a white hat, just so you get the characters right. Okay? I'm going to give you the shortened version. Now, the guy in the white hat, he's a good guy from the south. Okay? Jehoshaphat. Here's the guy, well, let me say it this way. And that's what I said to Randy. Who's the most wicked person you ever met? Well, he's a piker compared to this fellow. God says that nobody was more wicked than this guy. And on top of that, he's got that wife, Jezebel. If you think that isn't a problem. Well, all right, now I've just set the scene. Now here's what happens. Because what am I really interested in? I want to get to where they understand that God is controlling all of lives. And I don't know a story that works better than this. If you look on what is my page 29 there, Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, all that's fine. Down at the bottom, I just put in that little quote from John Plowman because it is a case where it reminds me of being careful in business or in any other relationship. It's dangerous to try to lick honey off of thorns. If you ever tried it, you're liable to get injured. And that's just what Jehoshaphat, if you know the story, God was kind to him, but he didn't need to be. Of course, if you turn to page 30, he had the standing core of 400 prophets in the first sentence, all right. Jehoshaphat, in his defense, did at least ask the question, isn't there one prophet of God? But of course, once that one prophet made a stand, Jehoshaphat seems to have ignored it, right? But that seems easy to pick on him until you think of yourself in that situation. You're in a foreign court. There's 400 guys in bright red priest's garb, and one guy they pull out of the dungeon probably not dressed particularly well, who gets up and makes some kind of strong remarks to the king. And if you know the courage that man had, you can remember when Ahab is looking you in the eye and saying, put him back in that dungeon, and he's saying, when I get back, and he's saying, I don't have to worry about that. I can tell you that right now. 400 guys in that room. You see, it's very easy to make fun of a guy like that, like Jehoshaphat and Micaiah, but when you see the courage of the one and the misfortune of the other, because he didn't have the courage to listen to the one man, you know you wouldn't want to be in his shoes. Now, I want to go over to page 31 here. And because there's a typo anyway, when they get to this first quote, it's actually 1 Kings there, not 2 Kings. He was successful at hiding himself from the Syrians, but can a man hide himself from God? There's an old spiritual that I like to listen to. Lois, tell you, sometime I'll play it for you. It's a really old spiritual. It's called, Come Out That Corner You Can't Hide, Sinner. Okay? And it just says, and she sings over and over real fast, death got a warrant out on you. You know what I mean? Death got a warrant out on you. And it's the most penetrating sort of a thing because you can't believe people are singing this in a service full of, mixed crowd, believers and unbelievers. Come out that corner, sinner, you can't hide, and you can't. Anybody you saw today who's an unbeliever, do you think they could hide? Well, I mean, here's a man telling you he's trying to hide. And T.S. Eliot used to say, there's one who remembers the way to your door. You see, there's one who remembers. Life you may evade, death you will not. You see, why? The stranger you won't deny. That stranger knows when God commands, he gets to go in that room and get you out of here. Now, he isn't a foe to you, is he? Feels like it. Remember, stranger to you, that death walking past you every night in the hallway, I try to bump into him when I walk by him now. You know why? What's he going to do to me? He's going to take my hand and place it right in the Lord's hand. I used to not like that idea that he was in there running up and down that hall when I was on my way to the bathroom, old man stuff. But now I just say, how you doing? One of these days you'll get to take me home. Now that may sound crazy, but I try to remind myself because I don't want to get fearful of that last foe that's not really a foe now. Heidi has nothing to fear. Now, it's easy for me to say that, and maybe I'll be a coward at the end of my days, but I hope not, because I think about it all the time, and I want to go. I want to see him. It's going to be the most wonderful thing to see him. And he's chosen my escort for me, hasn't he? That's how we're going to live. So if you see that page 31, the second, what's really the second after the quote, let no man reason he can hide from God. There's nothing random from God's viewpoint. I don't see many movies anymore, but I wanted to see one, and you guys maybe have seen. Anybody see Vantage Point? I don't remember who the actor was. No? It was, the idea was they would show the same assassination, I think it was, from different points of view around a square. What you could see from this vantage point. See, isn't life really all just a vantage point? If we go out tonight and take the nice gentleman who lives across the street and has that RV, and we examine him, God has one viewpoint when he looks at that guy's life. You and I have another. His wife has another. See, same guy, same facts. You know how sometimes you'll ride home with your wife after a meeting, and I'll say, well, that went pretty well. She'll be like, you are really an idiot. You know, you're like, what? And she's like, oh my, what's wrong with you? Well, didn't we have the same facts, see the same faces, the same body language? Turned out I was an idiot, usually, in our case. In your case, it may not work that way. In our case, it's pretty cut and dried. But that's why I like her to ride along in the car, so I don't misunderstand so many things. But you have to remember, that's really what you're explaining to people about their lives, isn't it? When you see them, Peggy, you're saying to them, listen, here's the facts about your life. Did you meet that husband by accident? Did she? Even an unbeliever? No chance. God was still telling his story. Well, she doesn't believe it. Why? Too busy putting her hands over her eyes. Now, mostly, as I said, Randy, a lot of people, that's an opening to talking to them about God and his government and all those things, because why? Sovereignty is a key to their life. It encourages them. If you can get that in your mind, you'll realize it should encourage them. God's looking after them, even while they're rebelling against him. He's feeding them. When a guy goes to sleep tonight, don't you want to ask him how he thinks he's going to be alive tomorrow morning? Well, his view is, my body functions, my lungs fill with air. I'm going to plant that little bomb that says, you know what? You might not wake up in the morning unless, what? God keeps you breathing every second. We have to remember that. That's true, isn't it? When you go to bed tonight, it's true of you. It's true of every unbeliever. We're all his subjects. Some of us are just pilgrims going on our way to heaven because he's changed our hearts, and the rest of us are pilgrims going to hell. If you simply make that statement to people, it ruins their day. Nobody gets to stay here. Ask that question. Look, go over there tonight. If you go over there to that one of those bars over there tonight and you're getting a little burger, and you ask the people there, let's see if I got this right. Is everybody a pilgrim? The guy said everybody's a pilgrim. Nobody gets to stay here. It's a downer. Because they want to stay here. Right? They do. And so right there, you gain ground. And what's that really about? That's about sovereignty, isn't it? I see. I'm a pilgrim. Well, I'm going the other direction. I've decided there's two roads. You see? Why? Well, if you remember that old Robert Frost poem they teach you, two roads divide, let's see, what is it? Two roads, diversion of yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and take one, and be one traveling along, I stood and looked down, one bent in the other growth. And then he finishes it. I shall be telling this with a sigh, ages and ages hence. Two roads, diversion of yellow wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that's made all the difference. Now, how did you choose that other road? If there were two roads and one of them said hell at the end of it and one of them said heaven, which one did you want, Jeff? No, you wanted that four-letter one. You said, well, I appreciate that, God. I know there's two roads, but I've always wanted to go to hell. And I'd like to do it as fast as I can, as recklessly as I can, because I have very little regard for my soul. God said, that guy is so dead in his thinking, so dark. If I don't intervene And it's not because he seems very smart, that fellow. Jeff didn't look too smart when he was trying to go to hell as fast as he could. Do you see anything that God ought to reward him for? No. But he did. He put him on the other road. And in fact, all of a sudden he could see well, that was a dangerous road I was on. A lot of people on it. Pretty broad. You know what I mean? I thought it was fun. All I was doing was storing up wrath for the day of wrath. It wasn't even fun in this world. Satan is a terrible master. You know, once you start to get that, you realize. Now, I'm going to skip forward here a minute. If you will go with me. That was the first part of this little book. I'm trying to get this. Now, if you look at what's page 33, now I would rather you learn sovereignty and providence by my telling of the story. You understand? I don't have to teach you the term if you can already understand how it works in the story. But if somebody wants to know what sovereignty is, here's a guy that can teach you. I don't know really your relationship anymore from New Zealanders but anybody with an accent has a king at one time or another. Now, people want a king as long as what? They like the kind of king that England has today. What kind of king does England have? He's impotent. That's right, he's impotent. He looks good, and he seems kindly, but can he do anything? Can he just decide today, arbitrarily, to raise the taxes? Be lucky they don't cut him off. Tradition's got him in there. Now, see, we lack that here. We face the other problem always. We're such a democratic society. That's going to be another problem you have when you talk to people. Equal. Fair only comes under equal. Everybody has an equal opportunity, equal chance, and you're thinking, well, you're sitting here and you're twice as tall and twice as smart, right? And your fingers are 6 feet long, and we're going to have a dunk contest. It doesn't look equal to me. I mean, you sit in a room and you see all the diversity of people, and you're like, how did they ever get sold an idea? We're all the same. I see equal under the law when somebody's oppressing you, equal in the vote. But surely we're not all of the same capability. I said today to a guy, if I could, I don't try to envy anybody, but there's a guy, I admire Charles. Why? Charles has what I don't have. Charles has a graciousness about him. I'm telling you, in a tenderness that I would have to be 150 before the Lord. Looks like he's going to get it through to me. I've just gotten civilized. But Charles has it. Now, Charles may say, I wish I were a little different. We all do that wrongly. I'm not saying that, but I'm telling you why I admire certain things. But the Lord chose us to be different kinds of men, didn't he? And I have to make sure that I'm careful to do what I'm equipped to do. Because it may be a whole different thing than what Charles does. Okay? Just because the Lord's given us, Andy, our own set. Remember 1 Corinthians 4. Paul argues, what do you have that wasn't given you? He wants it to end your boasting. Now, on top of all the natural gifts you have, you find out you can't even save yourself. For heaven's sake, you couldn't even make one contribution to your own salvation. Seems like that would humble us. But sometimes in Reformed circles, we get pretty prideful. Why? Well, God opened our eyes to these things, for heaven's sake. We know what the other guys don't. It's like secret knowledge. It's not supposed to be. That's why I'm always trying to plant this thing for you where I want that little guy in the northeast corner of Tennessee to hear Matt talk about how to study the Bible. I'm going to hound him till it happens. Because what? I want that guy to get good information, and Matt's got it. Unfortunately, Matt's in Laguna Hills. That's what I'm trying to, you see, when God puts you, and you have information like that that's useful to those poor guys who are out there who don't have it, get it to them. It's what God can get you to do. Now, there may be other things, but that's always on my mind when I look at you guys. Okay? Now, down at the bottom, this Ernst Rudolph quote, if you read it, I believe in that. That's why I realize you've got to simplify. If you're talking to people, remember that I said to you before, don't try to impress them, influence them. Okay? If they think you can speak all these languages, they'll have a very high regard for you. You know, you've got all this information and you've got all these terms that they don't get. Very high regard. You didn't do them any good. Some guys you need to use real technical language with. Some guys you don't. Whatever line of work you're in, you apply that same principle every day. Two guys walk in, one's in bib overalls, right? And one of them is in a tuxedo. Do you speak the same way to them when they come up and ask you something at the hardware store? No. The only people who do that are Christians. We got one serves them all. Lois, how far am I into it? You're waving. Oh, you're just combing your hair. It's like a bid at an auction. I'm sorry. Okay, we'll take 5 minutes here and then we'll go. Here, listen. The other thing, I wanted to give you this idea because I don't want to ever divorce it from dealing with people. Ben Franklin had a quote that I try to remember when I'm looking at people across the table, and that is, if I tell you something, you forget it. If I teach you, you'll remember it. But if I involve you, now you learn. And that's why questions, when you're asking questions of people, covers a lot of territory because they get involved. If he's governing that life, here's what happened to me. So then you tell him something that happened to you. Be personal. I lost my job. My boy ran off with that gypsy. Whatever happened. A lot of interesting things happen in your life. If you just start telling me, it's interesting to me, sometimes when it's your story, you don't think it's interesting. I know God's doing something. I want to see what it is. But that guy who starts to tell you about his life because you told him about yours, you've got him talking about how God governs. Okay? It's a big step to me in doing it. Let me go through one last thing and then we'll take this break. When you say he's a king or something like that, which is what I'm always trying to get across, I want you to go over to page 36 in there. If you didn't read this, you may not like the way I write these things, but I'm doing it for a reason. If I drop this book off at a little guy's church someplace in Waverly, Illinois, he doesn't always know the questions to follow up with. And I'm wanting to help him. Whether my questions are good or bad, they're the only ones I know to lead in that direction of helping him to have a Bible study that gets him to ask the right questions about the extent of God's governance and the extent of your freedom. That's really what I'm driving at in this case. And I say it because in Romans 8:28, in that passage lies the answer to your pain. Isn't that true? Whatever pain it is, like I say, I make light of it because I don't know how to do anything else, so I joke about things that hurt. You guys have your own way. But like I say, one time I had a wife and she ran off with a banjo player at the church. Well, is that fun? You think I really like that? You think that hurt? You know, here's a heathen, finally converts, and now that I can't even beat the guy up. I'm supposed to be civilized, and I don't know how to be very civilized. And he's a banjo player, and I'm paying him to teach her lessons. You can imagine how the heartbreak of these things, besides the children. Listen, I make fun of it because I don't want to cry. But I'm telling you, does this passage mean anything to me? What do you think? All things work together for good. Doesn't look like it. It turned out to be true. It was always true. I just finally saw that it was true. You're no different. You're in the very same place. And it's true. I don't care what your pain is. It has a purpose. And a pain with a purpose is not like a pain that is purposeless. You can live if you need that pain. How do I know you need it? Well, you have it. Huh? Isn't that the answer? You have it. If you didn't need it, you wouldn't have it. We'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come to the questions about the details in this story. Okay? Thanks. I just want you to, if you can get the questions on page 107, You can ask yourself these questions, these similar kind of questions about any life, including your own, on a daily basis. Isn't that right? I mean, if you think about these kind of questions, if you visit history, even a day like today, you'll run across these kind of questions. Look at the top paragraph. The soldier did not seek out service to God, nor was he rewarded by God for his timely service. You mean that heathen soldier was under God's control? Absolutely. So is the beer truck driver who ran your dog over. You know what I mean? Are they still under God's governance? Absolutely. Now, you have to think about it that way. Was he aware of it that day? If you were standing side by side invisibly with that soldier that day, does he know that he's serving a historical purpose? No. Neither does the beer truck driver. Is he still serving that purpose? Yes. Why? It's God's vantage point. If you can stand next to that guy, and that's why I try to throw in these things that you can see. He lets go. Remember, there's a big army out there. Right in the middle of that big army, there's one guy full of armor hiding from God. Yeah. He doesn't have much of an area you can shoot at him. And this guy, some nameless Syrian, fires an arrow in the air, a random arrow. Nothing less true than it was random. Random from his perspective, random from the perspective of the guy standing next to him. Not from heaven's perspective. The angels must have said, uh-oh, Ahab, he's in trouble. That baby's going through the air. You can imagine that that's how life really works. But the problem is, I was asking those simple questions. Was it windy that day, do you think? Did he stumble? Did the guy bump him? There's a bunch of guys shooting arrows. Did he jostle him to get it to go the right direction? It didn't matter if the guy shot it between his legs. It was going to go into the joint in the armor. Why? God's governing. Now, if that's really true, if you just think through one simple story like that, then consider your day. I see yours isn't the same. God doesn't govern the details. I was trying to explain to somebody today, if the pastor walks by you and you smile at him, does it make any difference? Does it matter if you work hard at what you do? If you teach the Bible study, you can coast through Bible studies, or if you apply yourself. Oh, really? Doesn't he govern those things too? Doesn't it make a difference if you smile at the pastor when he's coming out to talk to me? Maybe he's coming to talk to your son or your daughter. You don't care about that, huh? You don't care about any of that. Well, you better, because God has that whole chain, and it is a chain. These aren't random events. He's threading them like a quilt, like this, and every one of them is essential. You know how I know they're essential? They take place. Is that wrong? No, that's how it works. That's how we live. And if that doesn't get you to want to do your best, the little while that you're here, everything you say makes a difference in the history of mankind. Once I saw that, it changed some of the way I thought about things. Now, you're not getting merit. I'm not going to put you into a works thing, but I am going to tell you this. It was important that Paul go and get stoned. It's important to me today he got stoned. I bet he didn't think that was so important that day. He probably tried to avoid it too. You understand? It's important. How did he know it was going to be important to me? He didn't, but it is. How do you know? Now, I'm going to go ahead and let all that go. I don't care whether he's crouching or any of those things. I want to get to the questions. And you'll have to look at some of these things, simple ones. Lois, if you'll pass them out, I'll finish with this. If you start asking folks simple questions like I did here on this thing, any chance there's any chance is fate? Tell me about what you think of fate. They all believe in fate. All you're really trying to do is to tell them what he told them on Mars Hill. Give them the questions on the test first and then give them the other. If you think about Mars Hill, what does Paul say? I know what you're thinking. It's good that you're thinking about God. I'm going to tell you who He is. I see. What I'm saying is, I know you think it's fate. You just got the wrong name for it. You got it right. You didn't meet your husband by accident. You're right, it's destiny, but it's not really destiny. It's got a bigger name. It's sovereignty. And you're from New England, you know what a sovereign is. That's, New England, New Zealand. But when you tell people, you realize you're helping them to understand something that they've misnamed. That's all you're doing. They all, trust me, they have a form of it. If you say to somebody, you got that job. Were you 15 minutes late or 15 minutes early? Oh, what if it had gone the other way? What if the bus had taken off while you were there, or splashed the water on your pants? Wasn't going to happen. You know why? It was a divine appointment. People want to know it is, even while they're telling you they don't believe it. Otherwise, why do they believe in a nameless destiny? What they really are avoiding is what's standing behind it. If He's got a name, and He's really watching me, and He's not blind, I got a problem. And He'll want me, first thing you know, He'll want to tell me what to do. I want to be king, and He wants to be king. Let's call it destiny or fate. But they know better, folks. And if you say that to them, I promise you, they'll do it. If you say, you were just afraid to call it what it is. I thought better of you. I thought you'd be stronger than that. You're playing some kind of game with me. Well, they don't like it. But you can teach them. Let's take a look at the questions that you guys have there. These are the test questions. I'm talking about the ones with the X, right? And that's the ones you passed out, Lois. The first one being the, Bill, are you saying that God could prevent my cancer and didn't? I ask a series of these things, and it hardly matters the exact phrasing. They're all things that people say to you. And I'm just asking you, this is obviously about sovereignty, isn't it? You have to have an answer. Now, does it have to be the answer that I would give? No. But when you answer it, you want to make sure that you have a grasp of God's sovereignty, because otherwise you'll backpedal, won't you? Are you going to deny that He has any control over cancer because they don't like it? You have to deal with these things. Now, I'm going to show you the ones that are the harder ones when you deal with people. If we get to the end of this thing and there's time, I will tell you not what's right, I'll tell you what I try to do. You can either throw it out or like it. But like in this case, no matter what anybody says, I'm going to go through the ABCs in Bill Moore's method. Here's what it is. Anything in that statement I can agree with, that's what I ask myself first. See, I'm a simple person. I have to have that kind of a hook. Okay, am I going to agree with it? Is there anything I can amplify? I got another A. Now I go to B. Is there anything I can beautify? What I mean by that is, can I bring God's sovereignty or a larger context to it? They'll make it ugly. I'm trying to draw God into the conversation and cast their eyes above the horizon. Okay? Is there anything I can clarify? Lastly, for me, is there anything I can deny? See, I'm trying to do that every time I hear a paragraph, because people usually give you jumbled sort of questions and comments, and you have to see past it. And I don't know if these ways that I think it through are right, folks. I'm just trying to tell you that there are a few simple questions and a few simple things that you can boil us down to. And the more we talk about it, so if you have trouble with any of these or have any questions, for goodness sakes, I live to have you email me. I don't know what you think I want. I've gotten some nice emails this week, and if I never slept, it would be wonderful for me, to be honest with you. I'm not going to live forever. I'd rather talk to you about it. Maybe God will use me to influence something in your thinking which will influence your nephew, who will, I don't care where it leads. I want to see him and have run and done some of these things. You'll get number 4 all the time. Are you saying God sent the rains that drowned those innocent villagers? How about the earthquake today in Haiti? Aren't you the only one in the office that has an answer? But they don't like that answer. What did you expect? You still have the answer. Now, there are different ways to do it to me. You should ask them, how do you think it happened? Was God asleep? Always behind those things, there's always this. God's good, but unable to stop it. Or he could stop it, he must not be good. That's the question you're going to answer. It doesn't matter if it's an earthquake or tornado, a death of the father. That question is looming behind there. And there's only about 6 of them. Now, let me take you to one that, number 11. This is one that actually a guy said to me, an unconverted guy. And he drove over to my house at 6 o'clock in the morning to tell me. This is exactly what he did. He pulled up, and he was repairing a building for me. And he said, what gives God the right to rule over me? Now think about what I said to you. See how you got to divide this out? Could I agree with him on that? There's my A. I agree with him. God's ruling over you. I'm glad you finally seen that. That's going to be my, see what I mean? I'm going to amplify it. He's ruling over you. He always has been. You see what I mean? Now I'm going to say, can you imagine a divinity that actually has been governing you, you blind, poor, mulish fellow, all of your days, and you not only denied it, you've been ignorant of it. But he's glorious. Don't worry, you're not the only one. I was in the same boat. See, now, I've gone through there. Now I'm going to clarify for him, and here's where it comes. Before you came along and began praying for me, God and I had an agreement. He left me alone, I left him alone. Honest to goodness, that's exactly what he said to me. Well, when I quit laughing, the guy was angry. And he was frustrated. And I said to him, if I knew that I could do this to you, you know what I mean? Just telling you, just praying for you, if I knew I'd get this kind of instantaneously, I'd have done it a lot more vehemently, a lot earlier. Because I like it if you're really uncomfortable. I don't know, because I had said to him, how can you go to sleep at night? What makes you think you should wake up tomorrow morning? Well, he couldn't sleep anymore. But he actually believed it. He said, I left God alone, and he left me alone. So he never left you alone. See, I just denied, didn't I? I denied one of his statements, you see. But I try to agree with him when I can. Find one thing I can agree with. Why? We're all weak. If you just come in and thunder on him, it doesn't translate very well to some poor, weak soul who can't think. Now, when you go through here, you'll realize, I said to you, I'm encouraging you not only to talk to me, but anybody else. Do we care where you get the answer from? I just want you to grasp it. And I want you, obviously, the other thing I'm always trying to do is to push you out of your seat and into a bigger sphere of influence. But I couldn't be, if I can't do that, I can't do it myself. Maybe God wants to do it. You know a lot. I'm just trying to tell you it's okay. Get out there and dance. You can do it. Okay? And you learn a lot faster when you're in the middle of the routine, don't you? It becomes a lot more important when you realize you're going to be in the thing yourself. Number 15, are you saying I was hit by the train for a reason? It's because my stepdaughter got hit by a train and lost her leg. Now, she would tell you here tonight, it's the best thing that ever happened to me. She said, I had my leg up to the moonlight, drunk, going to court the next morning, try to regain her children, got her leg up in the moonlight at midnight as the train just missed killing her, and bleeding to death. And later she said, the dog started barking and I thought I was Jezebel. God had sent the dogs to eat me. A terrifying night. By that morning when they were amputating her leg, she didn't care about the leg anymore. She said, I've come to my senses. The next step, God must have to kill me because this is about as far as it can go. This is like the book of Judges, she said. And I did say to her, I thought you slept through those Bible studies. And she said, not all of them, you know, it's one of those things. But number 37, why doesn't God just save everyone? The old fairness thing, isn't that right? If God saves one, now I'm going to tell you that my answer, and it doesn't have to be yours, on those kind of things, if a guy asks you that with tears in his eyes, there's one answer. Of course, if he asks you in a smart aleck, like sometimes a pastor will say this to you when you're trying to convince him. Why doesn't God just save everyone? Like, I'm trying to figure out why he'd save one. What if we were right? You understand? Why would he bother? See, that might be enough of an answer there for that question. Now, I might want to go from there, but my point is, don't be afraid of these things. I'm not trying to make you feel like a student. I'm trying to make you feel like somebody like me who wants to learn how I can say it better the next time I'm talking to somebody. If I can help you, you will certainly help me. Okay? I told you, I came here to learn these things. I just happened to do it. Number 39 was the one I gave you, I mentioned briefly last week. People hate these but it's what people say to you, things like this. They picked up a little bit. This is very close to what a guy actually said to me. And you think about it, and he's saying, Farmer Jones, the 3 drunken boys go into the pond. Farmer Jones runs down the hill with 3 life preservers and throws 1. I hate him. My secretary said, I don't like him either, when she typed it. So I showed it to my wife. She didn't like Farmer Jones either. But people give you that. Now, if you start going back on how you can divide that up, what's true in it, the boys are drunken fools. I don't have a problem with that. It looks like every man to me. Put everybody in humanity in that car, let them drive into the pond. The one thing I know, when they're in that pond and Farmer Jones says, swim to shore, or let's say like this, walk to shore, right? It's only 4 feet tall. The boys say, I want to stay in the car. Why? They're like Jeff. They want to go to hell. I'll stay in the car. Don't shout at me. The real answer is going to be this thing again. This one we just answered. Why does Farmer Jones have to throw 1? What's he thinking? 3 drunken boys who won't walk to shore to save their own lives, and you expect Farmer Jones, you're going to put him on trial. The boys deserve to die. I don't know why he bothers. I know he's got 3 of those life preservers. He's got 5,000 life preservers. Now, the other thing you have to make sure you deny there is that Farmer Jones represents God. He doesn't represent God. He represents Farmer Jones and me. If I did that, it'd be criminal not to throw the life preservers. I'm a sinner. I know I'm with those boys. I just didn't get in the car tonight. Okay? It'd be wrong if God already extracted me from my own car and I wouldn't throw the life preservers. Right? If those boys escape tonight and they come across 3 more boys in the pond, wouldn't you want them to throw the life preservers to the next group of boys? But Farmer Jones isn't like that. He's altogether good, altogether wise, altogether holy. He makes no mistakes. He extends grace somehow. My goodness. When I said to you, it's a strange thing happened on my way to hell, I want you to understand, if I had a better title, I'd do it. It is your story. I will say it until you get it. You wanted to go to hell. You were on that road, and he changed your heart. You're no different. What pity we ought to have for those folks who just insist on being on that road. And I can't get them off it, Ron. I can't do it myself. Raise that hand, even though it's hanging down at your side, I say to them. And sometimes they do. Isn't that wonderful? You go to that prison, sometimes that guy with the bad arm, he raises it and he follows Christ, and 500 years from now, you're dancing with him before the throne of God. Let me just pray. And week 3, again, this is going to be about total depravity. This is one you have to get. So push yourself to get this, because it'll make sure that you get unconditional election. Okay? And remember, if you can't remember why I'm trying to match up evangelism with this, just hang in there. I'll get it to you. And I'm not going to tell you this one until Mary gets it. When Mary figures out what that other S is, then we'll all know. And it's coming up very shortly. In fact, it'll come up next week. Okay? Father, I appreciate the opportunity to speak about your ways. I hope that I've done you no disservice. I mean to be plain, I mean to get these things across. Please help them to get these things into their hearts, even if I've done less than is perfect on these things. You're the one who directs arrows, and you're directing all of these kinds of studies. And there's no doubt you have a purpose, in probably a united one in these people's lives and individually also. And I'm grateful to stand by and watch it. May we all praise you forever and ever until you gather us home. One big family. Amen.